And as soon as I took a Jivamukti class, I thought, not only do I have to make this my personal practice, I have to learn how to teach this. Because the very nature of a Jivamukti class is that it's structured where there's chanting, there's a little bit of yoga philosophy, there's meditation, plus the physical practice. And I thought, this is perfect for me. This is the platform I need in order to not just integrate a physical practice into my spiritual practice, but to share what I know. It took me about that much time. Now I'm over 50 years old. It took me that much time to figure out what I was really good at and what I was meant to do.
All right, here we go. This is the bonus episode for Hari-kirtana Das. Thank you guys for listening to the first episode where he shared his perspective on the Gita and yoga philosophy and why it can help guys. But this story, this bonus episode, is all about his path, and he's got a kind of a wild path. Kind of first glimpsing someone doing a headstand, the Gomez Adams, right, as a kid in probably the 1960s or 70s, watching him do it. Yep. And then he fast forward into being a courier in New York, delivering packages and envelopes to offices, which was totally a thing in the old days of New York in the late 70s, early 80s. And then his Krishna, devotion, and that emerged out of thing. But as you were just pointing out earlier, he kind of hit rock bottom.
Yep. He bottomed out, as a lot of spiritual seekers do.
Yep.
And wasn't quite sure where his path was going to lead him. And it led him to bhakti yoga and Krishna and free vegetarian food in the village, right? And music and that whole scene, and
ashrams, and then back to the city again, because the ashram wasn't quite his thing. It was too boring for the New Yorker.
That's right. So yeah, he's a very interesting guy, and he's doing great work with people. And this is just a little extra bonus episode. We had to give you as much as we could out of Hari's episode.
It's about 20 minutes. Thank you for listening. And again, thank you for support, and keep following us. Hari-kirtana Das, here's his story. So just before we jump into the Bhagavad Gita and a little bit of yoga philosophy, can you share a little bit about your story and path with yoga to kind of get us into your mindset for how you went down this road with this mission of sharing the message and the story and the love coming out of the Gita?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My first yoga role model was Gomez Adams from the Addams Family sitcom in the 1960s.
Yeah.
I kid you not. As far as I know, Gomez Adams, the character, was the first person to do headstand and other yoga poses on primetime television. There was another guy who was doing yoga on public television. I forgot his name, but I was more of an Addams Family kind of kid, not so much a PBS kid. And Gomez was also the president of the Yoga Society, which tells you just how mysterious and ooky the practice of yoga was to a Western audience in the 1960s. But even from a really young age, I was attracted to mystical things. I was the kind of kid who thought Doctor Strange comics were documentaries. That you could actually go find an ancient one in a cave somewhere and learn how to do that sort of thing. As I got a little older, as we get into the early 70s, books started coming out like Be Here Now, Ram Dass's book, after his trip to India, after his literal trips here stateside. And that became kind of my yoga Bible. And there were physical practices in the back of the book. The back of the book was kind of a how to do what I was just talking about in a more abstract way.
Mm-hmm.
And in a sense, I referenced the structure of that book for my in presenting the Bhagavad Gita. The book has 3 sections similar to Be Here Now. And the last section is how to actually do it, how to put the philosophy into practice. Anyway, I did some of the yoga poses in the back of the book, and that was my reference. But the emphasis was really on meditation. And I started a meditation practice really just based on books. I didn't have a teacher until I was in my 20s. I finished high school and decided I'm going to pursue a career as an experimental electronic musician, which is, of course, is a very lucrative career choice in the early 1970s. It worked out just about as well as one would expect someone without real knowledge of either music or electronics could possibly work out. But along the way, I still maintain this idea that a higher calling would be some kind of consciousness raising practice. And I was chanting various kinds of mantras. And I had a job that you can't probably get anymore. I was living in New York City, and I was a foot messenger. Once upon a time, the only way you could get a document from an office in one building on one side of town to an office in another building on another side of town was you had to mimeograph it, take a copy, and physically go to that place.
Yep.
So I was chanting mantras while I was walking. I was synchronizing my breathing and my walking and my chanting 8 hours a day while walking all over Midtown Manhattan. And I started chanting the Hare Krishna mantra because it was one I hadn't chanted. It was symmetrical. It really lent itself to walking and breathing in sync. And I had some friends who had taken up, they'd become Hare Krishna devotees. And at the time I was thinking, this is not really where I want to go. I was really more into Zen Buddhism and Taoism and those kind of philosophies. But there was some residual attraction, and I started chanting this mantra, and that was the first one that really made a difference, that I actually felt some effects. So I went to the Hare Krishna temple on West 55th Street because, if for no other reason, they had one of the very few really good vegetarian restaurants in the city at the now. Vegetarian is pretty normal in most places, but in the mid-1970s, New York City, very few and far between, and theirs was awesome. So I started going, and every night when I left the restaurant, there was this guy sitting out in front of the entrance to the restaurant with this big drum on his lap. And he was a big, cheerful guy. And I'd walk by him, and he would look at me, smile, and say, just chant Hare Krishna, and your life will be successful.
So by the way, this is late 70s, is that right?
This is, around 1977.
And there was a lot of Rajistic energy in New York in the late 70s, right?
New York City was a pretty rough environment around this time. And I was living in an unfinished basement underneath an art gallery in Soho. And I thought, if I move into a room at the Hare Krishna temple, then I can find out what is going on with this mantra. And it's probably going to be an upgrade. Plus, there's the restaurant right downstairs. So I walked in, I asked about it, and the guy at the front desk said, go up to the 6th floor, make a right, walk through the door, make another right, look in that office, and the guy who's in that office will get you set up. So I went up, walked through the door, opened the door to the office, and sure enough, it was the guy with the drum sitting outside the restaurant every night telling me to chant Hare Krishna, my life would be successful. Anyway.
Wow.
I did end up moving into the temple, and that is how I got my spiritual education insofar as yoga philosophy is concerned.
And you ultimately go to an ashram.
Yeah, this was it. The ashram was in Manhattan. It was in New York City. I lived in several different ashrams over the next several years. I lived in one in Boston. I lived in an intentional spiritual community out in rural Pennsylvania, the coldest winter I have ever spent in life. And then I left ashram life mostly because I wasn't cut out to be a renunciate.
Yep. You mentioned that in your book. You missed the energy and the pulse of New York, and you just couldn't deal with being on a remote farm, right?
It's true. The farm was serene and quiet and beautiful and peaceful, and I couldn't stand it. I'm just a New Yorker, and I take that obnoxious New York City ego with me pretty much everywhere I go. I've been living in Washington, D.C. now for closing in on 20 years. It took me almost all that time to get used to the idea that I was no longer living in New York. Anyway, I was drawn out of the ashram by just conflicting material desires that really didn't have anything to do with spiritual life. And I went about the business of pursuing them. And that didn't really work out all that well either. So much so that I ended up in my late 40s with just a train wreck of a life. The bottom fell out in every possible way. I wasn't particularly entrepreneurial, so I couldn't start a business, but I wasn't a particularly good employee either. So I never was really good at making money. And I wasn't able to sustain my first marriage. And I arrived at a point where I ran out of everything. I ran out of job opportunities. I ran out of money. I was literally at a point where I was sofa surfing, thanks to the generosity of people I wouldn't even ordinarily be friends with. So I face planted pretty solidly. The only good thing, not the only good thing, but the saving grace at that time of my life is I met a woman who somehow or other saw something in me that I don't think anybody else would have seen, took me seriously, and one evening asked me what I really believed. And I didn't want to tell her because I thought she'd think I was crazy, or that I was crazy. One way or another, either my beliefs were crazy or the fact that I had a life that had seemed to be totally disconnected to those beliefs at the time. would be crazy. So I told her in the most coded language I could come up with what I really believed. And it didn't work. Because she actually had a frame of reference I did not know about that allowed her to translate my code into a proper understanding of what I was saying, which she didn't let on to right away. All she did was respond by asking me a very reasonable question. If that's what you really believe, how can you live the way you are living? And it was at that moment that I realized that I had to live in alignment with what I really believed, or I would actually never be happy.
Yep.
And that was the starting point of my return to my spiritual life. Fortunately, before I left New York City for Washington, a friend of mine was teaching Bhagavad Gita classes at the Jivamukti Yoga Center in New York City, and he invited me to check it out. Whatever else I may have been doing up to this point of my life, I was always taking complex ideas and figuring out how to communicate those ideas in a way that was easy for someone else to wrap their head around.
Yep.
And that's how I became a yoga teacher.
So it's, go ahead, Larry.
I was say, can I just jump in with a question? So you're doing the messenger thing. You moved to the ashram.
Mm-hmm.
What happened between the ashram and the bottom falling out that led to the bottom falling out? Like, did you drift off the path and, just sort of drift away from the spiritual thing? And then when you met your present wife, you had this epiphany, or were you still trying the spiritual thing, being a New Yorker, and that didn't work? Like, what goes on in there?
I vacillated back and forth between pursuing material desires that had absolutely nothing to do with anything spiritual and pursuing a spiritual life on a full-on basis. So I was like a rock skimming across the surface of spiritual life.
1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Yes, and
trying to figure it out.
Back and forth. And it wasn't so much a matter of, like I said, it wasn't so much a matter of what I believed was really ultimately true. It was more a matter of just deciding where I was going to commit myself. And, other people may also have had this experience of conflicting desires, that you know what's right, or you feel like you know what's right, or you know what's good for you.
But you ignore it.
Huh?
But you kind of ignore it. You kind of like,
you pretend it's not there because you have some other desire that you think will bring you happiness if you can fulfill it.
Yeah.
And so that's what I was doing. And in the middle of all that, there was a marriage that really should not have happened. The unfortunate fact was that neither of us could be for the other what we each needed in a partner.
Yep.
And so despite a long, good faith effort that was pretty incompetent and very frustrating, I finally ended that relationship. But when I got to the end of that relationship, I had the typical midlife crisis, I want a do-over kind of mood. And so I tried to create a do-over for myself.
Yep.
But that do-over was all about fulfilling my more hedonistic desires.
Yeah. Yeah. And you were already over 40 at this time, right?
I'm 47 by the time this is happening.
Okay. So you're late 40s. Yeah.
Yeah. And that attempt at a do-over to enjoy all the things I missed while I was struggling so hard just to try to figure out how to make a living and how to make a bad marriage work. That was the formula for the bottom falling out. I tried to have my own business. Like I said, I'm not really that entrepreneurial. I didn't have enough money to make it go. It wasn't a good idea in the first place. So
you took like another swing in the material dream, and it just still wasn't working out. And the universe provides your now wife at a point to help validate and give affirmation and some clarity to the stuff that you thought was there. Mm-hmm. And she was able to shine a light or a mirror on that to give you better perception, to be able to accept some things that you knew were true or you suspected were true. And then the universe kind of puts your wheels in motion a little bit here. And is it fair to say that things over time started to come together and click a little bit more with more harmony and alignment?
Yeah. I restarted my spiritual practice incrementally, just one step at a time, because I had reached that point where it was almost like a 12-step situation. Mm-hmm. I had to admit I had totally lost control of my life. I needed some divine intervention. And my practice was a bhakti yoga practice, a devotional yoga practice. So one step at a time, I put my spiritual life back together, and I got the help that I needed from various places in order to get it back up to not just a complete practice, but it actually became my life. I became a full-time yoga teacher. I became a online course and workshop creator. I became an author of books about yoga philosophy. And for the past, 15 years now, that's been my full-time gig.